So I want to do some discussion. Let's talk about these just a little bit. Can you give me some common examples today of overreach? So you can look at it's right there, or you can look at the one on your piece of paper. Give me an example of a possible overreach. It doesn't have to be one that really happens. You could just make stuff up. I just want to get us thinking this way. Yeah.
Would it be the public school system educating children?
That's a good example.
The Pope being the president?
Right. Yep. We're going to talk about that soon. The American founders had the Pope in mind when they wrote the Constitution. Yep.
About Planned Parenthood.
Yeah. So if you talk specifically about the government involvement in Planned Parenthood. Right. Yeah, the destruction of the family by the state. Yep. What else? There's tons of examples. I think there's a barrier in your mind, and as soon as it breaks, you're going to think of a whole bunch of possibilities.
I feel like from the individual to the church, there could be overreach of like individuals interpreting the Bible their own way instead of following like orthodox views on.
Yeah, refusing to submit to elders, leaders in the church. Yeah.
Mandates from the state on an individual?
Yeah. Mandates of conscience or something like that. Yeah. What about like if two friends in their apartment decide to take the Lord's Supper together? That's right. Yeah. I lived in China for a summer, and China has churches. There are Christian churches in China, but in order to be registered as a church, you have to agree to the government stipulations, which they tell you, here's what passages you're allowed to preach, here's all the stuff you're not allowed to talk about. That's overreach, right? The government is directing the word. What else? Other thoughts?
I have a question. This might be naive. Why did you say two friends in an apartment taking the Lord's Supper together? Is it like not allowed to do that? Or what do you mean by that?
Right, because the administration of the sacraments is under the institution of the church.
Well, what about people like taking communion at their wedding ceremony? Is it different in that context?
I didn't want you to bring that up.
Sorry.
Since you did.
I know there was things about like communion that there.
Yeah, so
That's just new to me. Sorry.
That's a really good question. So this is a good example of I have a belief about this, and I will not enforce it on anyone. So if you disagree with me, you're totally fine. No judgment, no issues. Communion should not be taken at weddings. I don't believe. I took communion at my wedding. Okay. And then I started to read and thought, so I had almost every wedding I officiate, they take communion. I never say anything about it. I'm not trying to cause a fuss here or anything. But no, I don't believe that's the proper. Now I think you can fudge it a little bit because I'm a pastor and I'm coordinating this whole. Like I'm officiating the wedding, and it is generally a Christian ceremony. So I think you can wiggle around there a little bit, but I would say that's even different from two friends deciding to eat a goldfish and a drink of Sprite and say, this is the Lord's Supper, which you laugh at, but I've heard people doing that. Like, we just listened to a worship song and it was really powerful, so we took communion together.
Sorry, that's a little off topic.
No, that was good. That's a good question. Yeah, Emily. What's that? When it's like children leaving their parents' authority. I don't really know how that works. What is?
I don't know. Well, it involves the state and the individual. And it's generally the individual coming to the state and saying, I don't want my parents to be in charge of me anymore.
Right.
And the state ruling whether that is possible or not.
Yeah. So obviously obviously that's not an ideal situation. In a healthy family, that would never happen. Now, I think there are probably situations where you should get kids away from parents. There are really bad parents out there in the world. That's a bad thing. God doesn't want abusive parents in the house or anything. So there are definitely situations where you can't abide by these rules because. So if the let's say in a situation of emancipation, let's say the father is abusive, so now the state has to step in and take care of the welfare of the child. That's the father's problem, not the state's problem. The state is doing what they got to do because the father failed. Right, it's an overlap kind of thing, and I think it would be preferable, if possible, for the church to have a bigger role in that, but a lot of people don't go to church, and so, we got to deal with reality. If a child in our church had, total hypothetical, let's say there's a child in our church has abusive parents, kid needs to be taken away from the parents, I would gladly adopt that kid. I would take that kid in a heartbeat, because I think the church is a better place to do that than the state, but either is better than being abused by a parent. Yeah, that's an interesting question. That's good. Let's talk about it for a little bit. What's becoming clear? Let's do some takeaways and then we'll do questions. Maybe we should flip that. Questions and then takeaways.
So would you say that, just I guess, since we're Americans, like what role does the culture play in the spheres? Because is the state using culture to, like, I don't know, I'm trying to think because it's like, you're talking about how like culture with like a sexual revolution and other stuff, the state's using that to attack, but also aren't we all, like, each sphere has the ability to affect culture as a whole? So I was curious just because it's like the oversteps from any sphere, I think all play into like I guess human culture as a total.
Right. Yeah, I wouldn't see culture as a separate sphere at all. Culture is kind of like the water that every sphere swims in, right? What is our world like? And so we want to influence culture positively. That's the same as this. We want to influence all of culture positively at every single level. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
I just want to clarify something I heard that I might have heard wrong. Government programs disincentivize family involvement and enable reliance on government programs. Is that or is that not what you meant?
Let me find exactly what I said. Exactly. Yep. The state has created comprehensive government programs funded by taxpayers which disincentivize strong family involvement and make people dependent on government provision.
Copy. Okay, thank you.
So here would be an example. I didn't want to give a specific example necessarily in the talk, but if you have a child and there is no man in the house, you are eligible for like 6 times as much government provision. So the government, by definition, is incentivizing a broken household. You're giving more money to fatherless homes. Now, we can understand why they do that, right? That's a really hard situation. Single mothers have it really hard. But the government is incentivizing the destruction of families. Just by definition, that would be an example of that.
Thank you.
Do you think that the state, just for using that as the example, the state can intentionally and unintentionally drift towards totalitarianism and overreach? Like if Thomas Hobbes says that each state has a drift towards totalitarianism, do you think that's just like the nature of that sphere, whether they are intentionally dismantling things or not?
Yeah, I think whether they're conscious of it or not, it drifts. The river flows one way, whether it means to or not. So I don't think you necessarily have to impugn motives. You don't have to say I don't think we should always go to the there's a one world government, there's some kind of Illuminati backroom of really evil guys who are directing all the governments intentionally. I mean, maybe that's true, but I don't know that that's true. I think it's more likely that when you give any institution tons of power and resources, the wickedness of the human heart's always going to drift toward more control, more power. I want more, I want more. So I think it's a pretty natural. There's a guy named Robert Conquest. He wrote a book of rules. Maybe it's just 3 rules for cultural engagement, cultural development. I think it's his second rule. You could Google it here, but his second rule is any institution that is not explicitly right-wing will one day become left-wing. So everything drifts left. Everything drifts totalitarian. Everything drifts big government unless you set up the structure to resist that. So when our founders built the American system, they built it to resist the leftward drift. That's what our Constitution is for.
Could you go to that picture that is like the bubble, there's like the state is outside of the big bubble? Okay,
Yeah.
yeah. So if you were talking to someone whose worldview is like this, they're like, I reject God entirely.
Yeah.
He doesn't, I'm an atheist, let's say it. And they were like trying to argue like this church and state thing. How would you, in like 2 sentences, I'm putting you on the spot,
Yeah.
but like explain like, no, this is what it was originally for, but I believe that morality isn't an overreach. Because I feel like they would say, well, what you're saying is God should be in our government, and I don't believe that.
Yeah.
So how would you approach that conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, I understand you don't believe that.
Yeah.
That's totally fine. I believe that God created the world and Jesus rules over everything. So we disagree. We have disagreeing worldviews. I'm going to advocate for God's rule over everything.
Yeah.
You're going to advocate for,
Yeah.
or your personal desires to rule over everything, right? If God is not our God, then we will become our God. So yeah, I don't know that you can like reach common ground in 2 sentences, but you can say, hey, here's where you're standing. I'm not going to go there. I'm standing right here. Still love you, but we disagree.
I got in an argument once with a teacher.
Yeah.
It was a very ferocious, yelling argument. And I told her that I remember before they told us we couldn't pray in schools.
Yeah.
And that was before school shootings. That's when people could bring a rifle and, hanging in the back of their truck
Right.
in the parking lot of the school.
Right.
And she was so anti, no, you can't pray in church. I said, we have freedom of religion in this country, don't we? But that means we can't pray in church, or telling us where we can pray is telling us where we can't pray.
Yeah.
And she didn't budge an inch.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it was just her, if it was the mentality of all the teachers that she was in a circle of or what, but I remember
Yeah.
before, and it's not like that now.
Yeah, I mean, the government school system is not that old historically, a couple hundred years old, depending on how you defined it. And for the large majority of it in America, it was still a Christian education. You had not only prayers, but you were doing catechism questions, you were doing Bible studies. That was part of the public education experience. Now we can't even imagine that kind of thing happening, but yeah, it wasn't that long ago.
Even praying for a valedictorian speech is
Right. Right. Yeah, it wasn't long ago.
So going back to kind of like that 2-step process, says the state weakens the sphere through attack and then swoops in to take the responsibility. Where other places have we seen this in the past in our American history?
In American history, I don't.
Or either.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to think about like something that's not currently happening but has happened previously, and where we now live on the backside of that wake. If you don't have examples.
Yeah, I don't know if, I mean, looking at, there's not that many spheres up here and not that many responsibilities. So I don't know that we would say that the state has taken over word and sacrament yet. We're not in China yet, where the government's telling pastors exactly what they can preach. We're not in Canada yet, where they're telling them what they can and can't preach. But the state has taken over the family sphere. And I think there are examples of the state reaching into the individual sphere and making determinations of conscience. Now it's, a lot of this is just it's not super black and white. So there would be a lot of people that said the way the state reacted to COVID was a total violation of personal conscience. They forced me to think a certain way, believe a certain way about this thing. Other people would say that's because we were in a deadly pandemic and the state needed to prevent as many deaths as possible. Now, depending on where you land on, how dangerous COVID was, you're going to have a different perspective there. But I think there are examples of the state reaching into conscience and forcing people to act against their conscience on amoral issues. Yeah, I don't know that I have great examples of like this happened back then and now we're, yeah.
How would something like slavery fit into that? Like, that's the state imposing like a moral
Right.
valuation of humans, saying like, hey, this person isn't worth.
Yeah.
I don't know. If
Yeah,
that makes
no,
sense
that would be a good
as an
example.
example of that. But-
Yeah, I would make that I would say that's a violation of the word. The word means doctrine as
Right.
well. So
Yeah.
when the state says these people are worth less than these people, they're now making they're making a theological claim that the church should dispute. And heartbreakingly, in our history, many of our churches didn't dispute that for many years. But then, thankfully, it was the churches that did dispute that and got slavery abolished. So Christians are guilty on the issue of slavery. Christians are also the reason we don't have slavery anymore. So yeah, that's a good example of that.
Give
Yeah.
an example of like what it would look like for the state to support the family, like to partner and do that. Because I guess most of we've heard kind of like how it isn't
Yeah.
working.
Yeah.
But like in an ideal world, what that would look like.
So a good practical example that is on the ballot now is child education tax credits. So if parents choose to educate their children in a non-state school, there should be a financial incentive for that. That would be the state helping parents educate their children their way. Would be a good example.
That's on the ballot?
I don't know if it's on the.
Oh.
I don't know what on the ballot means technically. Some of the candidates we could vote for support that, and some do not support that. That's what I meant by on the ballot. Yeah.
I think I'm just having a hard time differentiating between institution 1 and institution 4. So we've got the soccer creator and the church.
Mhm.
And maybe I'm just like trying to put, I don't know if this isn't a fully baked question, but like if you going off like what Courtney was saying, like you've got a scenario and the Christian says what marriage is between a man and a woman, and the state has come out and said it's between a man and a man, a woman and a woman, or a man and a woman. It could be any of those things. And the person says, don't impose your religion on me. I don't want it. We have separation of church and state. And then I say, God says, this is what God says in his word.
Yep.
How is that not how's that not also the church imposing into the state? Overreach of the state? And why are we saying that it's institution 1 is going to the state, if that makes sense?
Right, because so again, church is the moral conscience of the nation. So the church is the means by which God disseminates his revelation, his design, his law to the world. We're the mouthpiece for that kind of thing. But when the church looks at the state and says that's not what marriage is, the church is not trying to take over marriage as a church institution. The church is trying to define it as God has defined it. The example you gave is a good hypothetical. I'm trying to think of how the church could overreach there. Like if the church said, it would be so. We have to be involved in everybody's marriage. You got to do it in the church, through the church. I have to do your marriage counseling. You have to talk to me about all your issues. That would be a church overreach into the area of marriage. But if the church just says, here's what marriage is according to God, that's not a church imposition. Does that make sense? You're right, it gets a little bit like, what exactly is the distinction here? But again, that's not the state's job at all. So it's not that the church is violating the state. It's that the church is just standing its ground and trying to get the state out. You don't get to talk about marriage. You don't get to determine marriage. You don't, that's not your job. Yeah, so maybe in that example, the church should stop right here. They're not trying to go all the way over into the state sphere. The state's just over
Or
here.
a wall or something.
Right, separate your church and state wall. Yeah, that's a good,
This also might not be fully based, and it's kind of similar to what Caleb was saying, but the loophole that I'm kind of seeing is the portion that people use to claim separation of church and state promotes the freedom of practice of all religions, right? And so that doesn't just include Christianity. So the law does permit all people to practice religions the way they want. So that puts us in a bit of a pickle as this church, trying to promote our values.
right. Yeah, which I would say I'm fine with. I'm pro-religious liberty.
We can still advocate for our morals, but
Yeah, and we should do it powerfully, and we should try to, I was gonna say take over the world, but that has like a violent connotation to it. I don't mean via violence, I mean via evangelizing. I mean, we should show the world how much better life is with Jesus, to the point where they all love him and want to walk in his ways, including Muslims and Hindus and Mormons and everybody else. So yeah, I agree, the state should not say, only this kind of church is, like, the First Amendment should stand.
And
The state's not involved.
And the church shouldn't be pushing for mandations of like, you can only be a Christian.
I believe that, yeah. I know Christians who disagree with that. I know some Christians who would say the state has a responsibility to provide order, and order requires one religion. You can't have multiple. So I disagree with that, but I'm just one guy. Yeah.
I'm trying to process the same thing as them,
Yeah.
like how those things can coexist, kind of.
Yeah.
Is it fair to say, like, if we follow the church's morals in who we vote for, because of the way our government is set up, we're electing individuals who will have beliefs and conscience that hold the same moral values that we have, and so they will use their personal beliefs and conscience to bring about justice and order. Is that like how we should be viewing the process, and how we could explain it to someone who's asking those questions, or am I missing something?
Roughly, but what you're describing is kind of that we want to vote for individuals who have certain beliefs that they form from the church and then get them into government so they can enact these laws. I would say the line is God to state, not through all these different spheres. That's where you could get into some of the sphere violations. So as Christians, we want God's moral law to rule everywhere, including politics, laws, government, things like that. So yeah, we want to vote for whatever candidate maximally enables God's law in the state.
How else would we practically get to a point where God's law is being enacted by the state? Is there an avenue that I'm missing? I think that's the piece that I'm not connecting.
Say that again, clarify
Like
that.
how, other than like electing the individuals who got their morals from the church into positions of power with the state, how else would God's law be implemented into the state, like from a practical standpoint?
No, I think that's the right way.
Okay,
Yeah, that's because we live in a representative government where you elect people
gotcha.
frequently. If we lived in like a Roman Empire where the emperor is going to be there for a long time, the tactic changes a little bit.
Right.
You don't get to like vote the next guy in. It's just going to be his son or whoever stabs him in the back or something like that. So it changes a little bit. So I think you're trying to vote in people who are in submission to God,
Okay.
and we're trying to evangelize everything, everyone, every institution, every person, everything. We want them to voluntarily choose to follow Jesus. We're not gun to the head, follow Jesus. That's not a real thing. Yeah, that's good questions. Again, this is ideal. We live so far from ideal that sometimes it's really hard to map reality onto the ideal. So it just gets complicated. Any questions here? I want to make sure we have plenty of time for the activity toward the end. So I'm moving kind of fast. Yeah.
Kind of keep digging up the difference in like a Valentine and candidate. So like you're voting for a candidate, but you're not voting for a person.
Yeah. Yeah, when I say Valentine, I mean like you're not affirming your love for them or your affection toward them or even your approval of them necessarily. So you might like a candidate a lot. Maybe there's a presidential candidate that you could really like, but that's not what a vote is when you submit that vote.
I have a question about platforms theory, double ask. I have found it's hard to really know what the platform is that candidates stand on based on news sources they say, what people say. What would you say is the best way to find out what the platform of a candidate actually is?
Yeah. Sometimes that's really hard because they're slimy. They're trying to not let you know what they really believe. So you always have, the opponent says, this guy wants to do this, this, and this. Who knows if that's true? And then sometimes the candidate themselves they don't really tell you what they want to do for one reason or another. So I don't know if I have an answer. I just affirm sometimes it's pretty hard to know what they're going to do. Usually if you dig around and do some research, especially if you do some research on both, go to partisan resources from both sides and try to figure out what's going on. So like one of the prominent ones in this election is on the Democratic side, they're big on saying Trump wants Project 2025. That's his platform. He's all 2025. And then when they asked Trump about it, he's like, I've never even heard of this. I didn't write it. I don't know what it is. I've never read it. I don't know anything about it. Now, he might be lying. I don't know what is, but there's just some discrepancy there. Like, what's his real platform? It's pretty hard to know. Again, not an answer, but just affirming. Sometimes it's hard to know exactly what their platform is. I wish they were way more clear with their platforms. What exactly are you going to do? The way I think of it is more through cabinet lens. So who is Harris or Trump going to bring on, and what do those people believe in? What do they stand for? Because usually they all have long histories of serving in government or serving somewhere, or they've been on podcasts where they talked about what they believe or something like that. You can kind of figure it out. Yeah.
How do you find out like what president or like what the candidate's cabinet's going to look like before they get voted into?
Yeah, I mean you can Google it and you'll find some information, but like these two presidential candidates haven't released their cabinets yet. They haven't said definitively, but you can get pretty close. Like they've said it's between this person and this person or something like that. And then you can also just kind of listen to who they're bringing into their circle. Who are they? So it was a really big deal. If you lean libertarian, then you probably really liked Robert F. Kennedy Jr. It was a really big deal when he joined Trump's team. So now RFK has come on as he's going to be something like the health secretary, take over the health sector as part of Trump's candidate, or part of Trump's cabinet. So I guess you kind of just read and listen to what they're talking about and see what seems to be coming up. If there's a tool out there, maybe you guys know of a website where you can just find this stuff, but I don't know a lot about it. Yeah.
When it comes to platform, let's say a candidate, like, you agree with most of their platform, but like, different policies hold different weight for us as Christians.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'm just curious, because it's like, oh, they fit all these boxes, but then they're pro-abortion. Like, what are we supposed to do in that situation?
Right. That's session 4.
Okay.
It's going to be great.
So
Great
mine
question.
kind of goes off that, is like, or it's really correlated to that, is that I feel like when people vote, it's always either like because of a social issue, or it's because of an economical issue, or it's because of a foreign affairs issue.
Yeah.
And is there, like, really just those three things is what really people vote for? And is there ones that Christians should care more about? Is there ones that Christians should care less about? Should Christians care more about the economic issues, the social issues, or foreign issues?
Yeah. I mean, I generally think we should care about more different things than we do. There's a lot of, like, this is the only issue I even know anything about. It's the only one I care about. I don't think that's necessarily good. But I also believe some issues matter more than other issues. I won't necessarily prescribe those to you. I think as a Christian, you should come to those conclusions on your own and figure out which issues matter most to you, which is some of what we're going to do in this next section. But you're right. That's how most people think of it. Or, like being really honest, a lot of people vote for one person because they hate the other person. So it's not about like, I love this platform. It's just, I hate that person over there, and I'm going to vote against them no matter what. Which, again, is not a reason we should vote.
But
Yeah.
it's kind of going back, this is a half-baked thought, obviously. So I grew up in the South, cultural Christian. And so when we talk about like the 50s and this kind of like, we were a very Christian nation. And then I think about China and how the church has done really well in a non-Christian government. How do you balance those two things? Because to me, the South is all honors me with their lips, but hearts are far from me. Like that was just like everybody I knew. So how do you like balance those two ideas, like Christian government, unchristian people, non-Christian government, Christian people, church thriving?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. I think I gotta be careful how I say this. I kind of grew up hearing that when Christians get persecuted, that's when the church grows. The reality is sometimes that's when the church grows, and sometimes the church dies. There are entire nations that used to be thoroughly Christian and now have no Christian influence. England is a great example. France is a great example. Europe is, I think, the least Christian by percentage of any continent in the U.S., and Europe used to be thoroughly Christian, like 99% Christian. So sometimes persecution leads to church boom, like what's happening in China. Sometimes it leads to total destruction of the church. Either way, I don't think we can necessarily make our decisions based on, well, I'm hoping that if they mistreat us bad enough, then the church will grow, because it's a bit of a gamble. But you're right, cultural Christianity in the South, that's also, we should want to disciple those people into obedience to Christ. I would, if I had to choose between whether my neighbors in my neighborhood were cultural Christian from Texas or hostile, violent communists, that's an easy choice for me. So if we're just talking about helping the world flourish, easy decisions to be made there. Both in terms of my quality of life and my ability to evangelize those people. It's going to be a whole lot easier there. So that might not have been helpful or clear, but yeah. Okay, yeah, one more.
Sorry. Okay, so if we're supposed to vote, you said first for cabinet, then platform, then candidate. Is that because our government is so far off from the original idea? Like, if that's how we should vote, then why wasn't it set up as like, that's how we vote? Why are we first voting for candidate? Does that make sense?
I think that's what we've always been voting for. I think that is how it was set up.
Okay.
That when I say you're voting for cabinet platform, I don't mean
Yeah.
you're submitting 3 different votes.
Right.
I'm saying
Yeah.
you got to
So
evaluate
we'll
through
think about
these lenses.
Okay.
Yeah, when we think about which candidate to choose. So basically I'm just saying it's naive to say, I like this person, I don't like this person, therefore that's who I'm going to vote for.
Yeah.
There's way more going on than that. That's a really naive way to vote. We have to look at some other things as well. And yeah, I think that's how it always was. When a president comes in, always, the federal departments have been set up throughout history, so things have changed over time. The cabinets have grown exponentially as the government has grown, things like that. The cabinet probably didn't used to be near as big of a deal because the government didn't do hardly anything. It was just the military, head of military. Questions or thoughts? What do you guys think? Is that helpful? What's helpful about it? What's not helpful about it?
It takes our emotions out of the process. Well,
Yeah. Yeah.
I think this goes back to what was being asked earlier about like which issues should we give more weight to.
Mm-hmm.
But like a lot of these are really broad issues, like
Right.
societal issues encompasses a lot of like that encompasses abortion and like a safety net for like homeless, like,
Right.
which thing do I prioritize, or is there space to like take hot button issues that are
Mm-hmm.
of particular importance to you and say, okay, I'm gonna focus on those issues instead of the more broad?
You definitely can do that. Yeah, you could say, you could discern, here are the 5 issues that I care most about.
Okay.
But I think that's a little bit of a truncated way to do it, because you're not necessarily looking at biblical clarity, practical consequences, and you might be leaving out other important things that you hadn't considered before. So you're totally right. This is 8 is a really condensed version. You could go home and separate each of those into its components. So maybe under social policy, there might be 5 things that you want to list out. Now do it with that whole 5. And
Yeah, I guess
do the
that's
same.
what I was.
Yeah.
That's what I was saying.
Yep. Yeah, you can split this out infinitely if you want to. It's just a tool to help you think through what matters and what's clear. What else? Other thoughts? What's helpful?
What if you can't get past one issue?
Can't get past one issue? Yeah, so there might be a situation where one, on the practical consequences, is like, it's not just a 10, it's a 1,000 for you. So that would be called a single issue voter, typically. That can be a bad thing, but I think there are situations in which that could be a good thing. If you were let's say 1940s Germany was a democratic country, and you had to vote in that election, maybe the Holocaust should be your one issue. Like, should we enslave and kill all the Jews, or should we not? That's a pretty big one issue vote. You should vote for the guy that doesn't want to do that horrible thing. So there are times where a single issue should stand out that way, but there are also times that it shouldn't.
So it's not necessarily foolish.
No. I'm 95% a one-issue voter.
I might have missed it when you were explaining the biblical clarity. I think that was probably one of the harder parts, because I'm like, the Bible isn't specific about a lot of these areas, so it's kind of hard to figure out what is clear about that.
Yeah, I think that's where sphere sovereignty, so in Platt's book, he doesn't bring in the sphere sovereignty component to it. I think that really clarifies it. Because you don't have to think, what does the Bible say about immigration? Instead, you just have to think, what sphere does that kind of thing fall into, and then which candidate cabinet platform is going to put it in that sphere most appropriately, or things like that. So like a good example that I was thinking of earlier today, have you guys heard someone say Jesus was a socialist? You ever heard that claim before, seen it on social media, things like that? Now, when somebody says that, what are they saying? What are they identifying? Huh?
Trying to say socialism's okay or good or.
Yeah, they're trying to promote socialism, generally. What are they saying about Jesus?
He cared for the sick and hungry. And
Yeah, Jesus cared for the poor. He tells us to care for the poor. That's true, right? Totally true, 100% true. Socialism is when the state takes over welfare. Was Jesus a proponent of that? No. Who did he command to take care of the poor? The church, his people, Christians. So Jesus was most certainly not a socialist. That's a conflation of sphere sovereignty. So when you have the sphere sovereignty framework in mind, you can evade a lot of those slimy, cliches. That you can think more clearly about those categories. We should absolutely care for the poor, and maybe we shouldn't do it by having the government put a gun to your head and saying, here's what you're going to pay me so that I can, those are different things. We can care for the poor and not vote for a socialist. That's a possibility.
How do we go about doing this with so we have judges running for office right now. It seems like different than, I guess, I don't know, it just seems different than a candidate for executive or legislative branch.
Yeah, it might be a little bit different. You'd probably just change the question over there on the right and say which which judge does the best job at enforcing, you just change it depending on their job, enforcing that this issue is placed in its proper sphere, or something like that. A judge theoretically should be a totally nonpartisan, impartial. Their job is to uphold the Constitution, no matter how they feel about it. Sadly, that's not at all true in our world today. Judges are absolutely partisan on both sides. Yeah. Taylor, real quick.
Did you have a question?
Did
No, I
you?
didn't have a
Oh,
question.
okay, sorry. I must have been seeing Kristen through you.
I'm wrestling a little bit with like our government was built on Christian values, but our nation is declining in terms of Christianity. So are you inferring that by voting for a more Christian nation, our nation will become more Christian? Or what is the inference there, I guess? Or if the government only works when our people are Christian, but our people aren't Christian. I guess maybe it's just a fire under our butt to evangelize, but
Yeah, they definitely should be. So we want both,
yeah.
right? We want people to be Christians, and we want the nation to cause flourishing. We should be really active in both of those spheres. I don't think we don't have to pick or choose one or the other. So we should evangelize, we should disciple people, we should do all that stuff personally, and we should vote for God to get his way as much as possible. Because, so like yesterday, my argument, that 4-point logical argument, was Jesus tells us to love our neighbors. Loving means you fight for their best. Their best happens when they obey God. Therefore, we should vote to help them obey God maximally. We want as much of God's law enshrined in our law as possible because we love our neighbors. So it's not, I would be hesitant to say things like we want to make the nation Christian for a lot of reasons. Christian is a term meaning saved, and I don't think nations don't get saved, people get saved. But I know what people mean when they say that, obviously. Yeah. Again, like I said a little while ago, when we look at the reality we live in and the ideal picture in Scripture, they're so far apart. We need to be thinking 500-year plan to get us that direction. That's our job. That's what SALT should do. We should preserve. We should try to move things in the right direction. We're not thinking instant government takeover. We're not thinking the Protestant Pope becomes the king. It's none of that stuff. We don't want that at all. Now the interesting piece, I might be opening a can of worms that's way too big for the 8 minutes we have left. But according to I'm using our generally, but I think we're all 95% on the same page. According to our understanding of how history is going to play itself out, our view of the end times, we don't think this is going to succeed. It's like we should work for things to get better and better and expect that they will get worse and worse at the same time. So when they get worse, we shouldn't be like, oh no, we're blowing it. We should be like, yeah, that's what Jesus said was going to happen. Things are going to get worse and worse until he finally comes back. And we should also work for the betterment of our nation, and we should try to love our neighbors. So we can do both of those things. Yeah.
I have no idea if you're prepared to answer this at all, but I feel like I have heard a lot in the last few years, like the term Christian nationalism, like way more than I've ever heard it in my life.
Yeah.
Could you give just like some general advice on how to articulate a response to someone accusing Christians of participating in Christian nationalism as opposed to simply voting according to their conscience?
Right. My first question always would be, define it.
Okay.
What do you mean when you say that? Because depending on their definition, I very well may be a Christian nationalist. But depending on their definition, I might not be. That term doesn't mean anything in itself. It's kind of thrown around as like a attack label on whoever you don't like to try to silence them. So you got to ask them what they mean by it. If I ask somebody, what do you mean Christian nationalism? And they said, you want the laws to be Christian morality. I'd say, yeah. I do. I want God to be Lord over everything. If they say, you want the pastor to be the king of the country, I'll say, no, most certainly I do not. I don't want a Pope 2.0. That's really bad. So it just depends what they mean by it. Again, it's that diagram. God is over every sphere. Individual spheres don't violate each other. We don't want the new Ayatollah. That's bad. Yeah, that's a good question. I would say the same thing to a question about theonomy. That might be a term you guys are less familiar with, but if somebody said, are you a theonomist? I would say define it. Because depending on your definition, maybe not. Yeah.
Should we want, I haven't read the book of Leviticus in a while, but should we want our laws in our country to match the book of Leviticus? I'm not talking about like the ceremonial laws, but just more general laws. As I think there was a law, and I could be totally wrong, but like if you're caught stealing, the punishment is just cut off the hand and everything. Do we generally want that in our nation for our laws to match biblical laws?
Sort of, depending on what we're talking about. So the Old Testament law is divided into three categories. You have ceremonial law, which was how do you get clean to be in the presence of God as the Jewish people. You have civil law, which is how does the Israelite theocracy work. And then you have moral law, which is the eternal law of God that is on this diagram. When I said God and his moral law rule over all of creation, that's the third part of the law. Jesus fulfilled and did away with the ceremonial law in his death and resurrection. The civil law is done away with when you get outside of the theocratic nation state of Israel. The civil law can still be helpful for some things, but we're not bound to it at all. We are all bound to the moral law constantly. That's at the very beginning when I said God rules with his moral law, whether you believe in him or not. That's what I was talking about there. So in general,
Moral law is the Ten Commandments?
the Ten Commandments is a summary of the moral law. So there's 250 moral laws in the Old Testament or something like that. God summarized the moral law into the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai. Then Jesus summarized the Ten Commandments into the two commandments in the Gospels. Love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. That was the summary of the moral law. So we should generally want our laws to reflect God's moral law. Now, I think when you get to things like caught stealing, cut off the hand, there might be some overlap between civil and moral laws. So that law might have some things about because you are an Israelite and this is a theocratic nation of Israel, the punishment is this for these crimes. Whereas if you get outside of Israel, the punishment may not be. So the principle is thieves should be punished. It's not thieves should be punished by having their hand cut off when they steal a piece of bread. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
We want our laws to reflect God's law. Yep. You also have to distinguish between sins and crimes. So some violations of the moral law are sins, but they're not crimes. Covetousness is a sin. It's not a crime. The state should not punish you because you like your neighbor's car more than your car. But then some moral laws are crimes. If you murder, that's a crime. The state should come in and punish you for that. That's good. Okay, we're going to wrap it up.